In 1776, a crowd in New York City threw ropes around a giant gilded statue of their king, hauled it to the ground, and melted it down into musket balls. Then they used those musket balls to shoot at the king's own soldiers. That is, more or less, the entire energy of the American Revolution in one image. Because here's the part they skip in school. On paper, the Americans should have lost. Badly. This was the most powerful empire the world had ever seen. The British, fresh off beating France, Spain, and basically everyone. Versus 13 squabbling colonies with no navy, no money, no real army, and a charming habit of marching home the second their contract expired. This is the story of how that broke, half-trained, hopelessly outgunned mob picked a fight with a superpower, and somehow won. Let's start in 763, with Britain on top of the world. They'd just won the 7 Years' War, kicked France off most of North America, and built an empire so big the sun genuinely never set on it. Total victory. There was just one problem. Winning was expensive. Britain came out of that war buried in debt, with a brand new continent to defend, and a parliament that looked across the Atlantic and thought, those colonists should help pay for this. Honestly, not unreasonable. The average Brit was taxed into the ground. The average American was barely taxed at all. For a century, London had mostly left the colonies alone to do their own thing, a policy with the wonderfully smug name, salutary neglect. That neglect was about to end. And it turns out, after 100 years of being left alone, people get a little attached to being left alone. Enter the Stamp Act of 1765, a tax on basically every piece of paper in the colonies. Newspapers, contracts, playing cards, even the document certifying you'd paid your other taxes. The colonists lost their minds. And here's the crucial bit, the part that made this a revolution instead of a tantrum. It was never really about the money. The tax was tiny. It was about the principle. The colonists had no representatives in the British Parliament. So who exactly gave Parliament the right to reach into their pockets? No taxation without representation. Wasn't a slogan about pennies. It was an argument about consent, about who gets to rule whom. And once you start asking that question out loud, things tend to escalate. They escalated. Tax collectors got tarred and feathered, which, for the record, is not a fun party game. It's scalding tar and public humiliation. Mobs burned officials in effigy. Britain, rattled, repealed the tax, then immediately passed a law insisting it had the right to tax the colonies, in all cases whatsoever, just so nobody got the wrong idea. This soothed precisely no one. By 1770, tension in Boston boiled over. A jittery squad of British soldiers, surrounded by a jeering crowd hurling snowballs and rocks, opened fire. 5 colonists died. The Patriots called it a massacre, printed propaganda about it, and made sure nobody ever forgot. Fun twist, the lawyer who defended those British soldiers in court, and got most of them acquitted, was a patriot named John Adams. Remember him? Then came the tea. In 1773, Parliament handed a struggling mega-corporation, the East India Company, a sweetheart deal to dump cheap tea on the colonies. Cheaper tea sounds great, until you realize the catch. Buying it meant accepting Parliament's right to tax you. The principle, again. So one December night, a gang of Bostonians disguised themselves, badly, as Mohawk warriors, boarded 3 ships, and threw an entire fortune in tea straight into the harbor. The Boston Tea Party. Britain was not amused. London responded with a series of laws so harsh the colonists renamed them the Intolerable Acts. Boston's port, closed. Massachusetts government, gutted. The message was clear. Fall in line, or else. It backfired spectacularly. Instead of isolating Boston, it united the colonies behind it. In 1774, delegates from 12 colonies met in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress, the first time these 13 very different places sat in one room and realized they might actually need each other. They sent the king one more polite letter. He didn't bother replying. The gloves were off. April 19th, 1775. The British march out of Boston to seize a stash of colonial weapons in a town called Concord. It's supposed to be a quiet operation. It is not quiet. Patriot riders, Paul Revere among them, have already galloped across the countryside screaming that the redcoats are coming. At dawn, on Lexington Green, a few dozen militiamen face down the British column. Someone fires a shot. To this day, nobody knows who. When the smoke clears, 8 Americans are dead. Later poets called it the shot heard round the world. The war had begun, and nobody had actually decided to start it. The British push onto Concord, find barely any weapons, and turn back toward Boston, straight into a nightmare. Thousands of militiamen line the road, firing from behind every wall, tree, and barn. It is not a battle, it's a gauntlet. The redcoats stagger back into the city, having lost nearly 3 times as many men as the untrained rabble. They came to disarm. 2 months later, that rabble proved Lexington was no fluke. At Bunker Hill, dug in on the heights above Boston, they let the British march uphill into them, twice, and mowed them down. The British took the hill, but it cost them over 1,000 casualties. As one British general put it, a few more victories like that, and there'd be no British army left. The mob could fight. Now it just needed someone to lead it. Congress picked a tall, quiet Virginia plantation owner with some military experience and an unbeatable air of, I should obviously be in charge. George Washington. He showed up outside Boston and found his glorious Continental Army to be a mess. Half-armed, barely trained, no discipline, almost no gunpowder, and riddled with disease. But Washington had one thing the British didn't expect: patience and a refusal to lose the one thing that mattered: the Army's continued existence. Meanwhile, the case for a full break with Britain went mainstream, thanks to a pamphlet called Common Sense by a recent immigrant named Thomas Paine. In plain, blistering English, Paine mocked the entire idea of kings and made independence sound less like treason and more like obvious math. It sold by the hundreds of thousands. So on July 4th, 1776, Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. A genuinely radical idea, and we'll come back to the gap between that sentence and reality. Quick myth buster. Almost nobody actually signed it on July 4th. Most signatures came weeks later, in August. The 4th is the day they adopted the words. The fireworks date stuck because happy late adoption. Plus, signing. Over. Several weeks day doesn't sell hot dogs. And then, the United States almost died in its first summer. The British arrived at New York with the largest invasion force in their history. Hundreds of ships, tens of thousands of professional soldiers. They proceeded to hand Washington defeat after humiliating defeat, chasing his shrinking, freezing army clean across New Jersey. By December, Washington had a few thousand exhausted men left, most about to quit, and the whole revolution was days from simply evaporating. So Washington did the desperate, slightly insane thing. On Christmas night, 1776, in a brutal snowstorm, he ferried his ragged army across the ice-choked Delaware River in the dark and marched on the town of Trenton, held by a garrison of German soldiers fighting for the British. They never saw it coming. The attack was over in under an hour. Trenton fell. A week later, Washington outfoxed the British again at Princeton. In military terms, these were small fights. In every term that actually mattered, they were everything. They proved the war wasn't over. They convinced men to re-enlist, and they put the world on notice that this scrappy little rebellion had a pulse. And the world, specifically, one very interested country across the ocean, was watching. That country was France. Humiliated by Britain in the last war, the French wanted revenge, and they were quietly slipping the American supplies. But they weren't about to bet on a loser. They needed proof the Americans could actually win something big. In 1777, they got it. A British army under General John Burgoyne marched down from Canada with a clever plan to slice the colonies in half. Instead, it got swallowed by the wilderness, harassed at every step, and surrounded by swarming American forces near Saratoga, New York. On October 17, 1777, Burgoyne surrendered his entire army. It was the first time a full British field army had laid down its arms to the Americans, and in the courts of Europe it landed like a thunderclap. France was sold. In early 1778, it signed a formal alliance with the United States and went to war with Britain. Spain piled on. Suddenly, Britain wasn't fighting a colonial rebellion. It was fighting a world war, stretched across oceans, forced to defend everything everywhere at once. The superpower had just inherited a superpower-sized problem. Don't picture a victory lap. Picture Valley Forge, the winter of 1777. Washington's army starving, freezing, and dying in camp while the British sat comfortably in Philadelphia. But something happened in that misery. A blunt Prussian officer named von Steuben showed up and did what no one had managed before. He drilled the Continental Army into an actual, professional fighting force. The mob that limped into Valley Forge marched out as soldiers. Frustrated in the north, Britain rolled the dice on a new plan. Conquer the South, where they were sure secret loyalists would rise up and rally to the king. Worth noting, plenty of colonists genuinely were loyalists. Roughly a fifth of the population wanted nothing to do with independence. This was also, in many places, a brutal civil war between neighbors. At first, the Southern strategy worked. The British took Charleston and won smashing victories. Then it curdled. American commanders like Nathaniel Greene refused to be pinned down, trading ground for time and bleeding the British with every mile. Backwoods militia shattered loyalist forces at Kings Mountain. Daniel Morgan annihilated a feared British column at Cowpens. The British general chasing them all over the South, Lord Cornwallis, kept winning battles while losing men he couldn't replace. Eventually, battered and frustrated, he marched his army to a little tobacco port in Virginia to rest and resupply by sea. It was called Yorktown. It was a trap, and he'd walked right into it. Here's where that French alliance paid off in full. A French fleet swept up and seized control of the waters off Yorktown, slamming the door on any British escape or rescue by sea. On land, Washington and his French ally Rochambeau raced south and surrounded Cornwallis completely. Trapped, outnumbered, cut off, and pounded by Allied artillery, Cornwallis ran out of options. On October 19, 1781, his army marched out and surrendered. Roughly 8,000 men. Legend says the British band played a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down." Whether or not that's literally true, it could not have been more fitting. The greatest empire on earth had just been beaten by the bankrupt, half-trained mob it once dismissed as a joke. Yorktown broke Britain's will to keep fighting. 2 years later, in 1783, the Treaty of Paris made it official. The United States of America was free, independent, and real. So how did they actually do it? No single reason. Britain was fighting a war 3,000 miles from home against an enemy that could lose battle after battle and simply refuse to die. Washington's real genius wasn't winning. He lost plenty. It was never letting his army be destroyed long enough for the British to get tired and the French to get involved. But let's be honest, because the best history is, this was a revolution that declared, all men are created equal, while 1 in 5 people in those colonies were enslaved. And that contradiction didn't get resolved that summer. It got postponed at a horrific cost for almost a century. The revolution didn't finish the idea. It just wrote it down and dared every generation after to actually mean it. That's the strange, unfinished, genuinely radical thing those farmers and printers and shopkeepers set loose on the world in 1776. 250 years ago, a mob with no business winning took on a superpower and won, and then handed the rest of us the much harder job of living up to what they wrote. Not bad for a bunch of people who kept going home when their contracts ran out.